Our first speaker today is Dr. Daniel Sullivan. He's the Executive Vice President and the Director of Research at the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago. At the Federal Reserve, he's responsible for monetary policy, for banking and financial markets, for microeconomics and regional economics. He heads up the research section, which includes over 130 people. He's written over 36 papers on labor economics. He's been busy these past couple weeks attending the meetings of the Federal Open Market Committee. This is the group responsible for formulating national monetary policy, so we appreciate him making time to come and join us today. And when I asked him how he became interested in economics, he told me it began when he was a very young boy. His father got an MBA late in life, so his father began teaching him rudimentary aspects of economics before he was even 10 years old. He even learned how to do calculus at a very young age. So here at the Family Impact Seminar, of course, we love these real-life stories about how these early family influences have profound impacts throughout life. And when I asked him why he got interested in labor economics, he told me that came about because he thinks it's the part of economics that's really key to people's lives. So his talk today is Trends in Labor Force Supply and Demand. Dr. Sullivan, welcome.
Thank you very much. It's fun to be here. And I think I have a pretty easy job. I already knew it was going to be easy. I'm supposed to sort of set the stage for our distinguished panelists who have solutions to the question of how do we get the young people of today in a position to have good enough skills so they'll succeed in the labor market in the future. And then Karen has already taken a shot at that. So I'm going to add a few other reasons to sort of support this, I think, pretty obvious proposition that we really ought to be worrying a lot about getting the right kind of skills training for the full range of young people today. So just to preview a few of the things I'm going to say, there's a bunch of sort of demographic and long-running trends that are afoot in the world today, and they have the basic impact that this rate at which the labor force is going to be growing is slowing down. It has slowed down, and it's going to remain slower than we've had in previous decades for another decade or two to come. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, but if you're, say, an employer and you're thinking about like how many workers are you going to be able to draw from in the future, this is going to be a bit of a change. We've actually been through a period of where, in some sense, it's been a buyer's market for labor. That when employers put out a help wanted sign, they get lots of people applying. They're not always happy with everybody that applies, even today. But in the future, there's going to probably be a bigger premium on finding those workers. So I think you want to sort of, as best you can, make the workers that are going to be available productive, and that's going to help business. If you want economic growth to continue, it's going to be increasingly important to be able to sort of have a well-skilled labor force. Okay. And then another part of my job that Karen gave me was to sort of talk about what are the kinds of jobs that are going to be most available. And in fact, there's a branch of the Bureau of Labor Statistics which works very hard to try and forecast what are the kind of jobs that are going to be available. I couldn't claim to be an expert on that, although I've read up on it now over the last few weeks. And actually, it's very interesting. What ends up happening, though, is they basically almost always forecast that past trends will continue. So, for instance, the share of the economy that's manufacturing has, been falling for decades. It's probably going to continue to fall. That's the kind of thing that they say. And I think that's probably quite reasonable. But the thing maybe I would emphasize is that those kind of judgments are quite uncertain. You never know exactly what's going to happen. It's very difficult to forecast these things. And, I'm going to actually throw up a few reasons to, wonder, for instance, like, will manufacturing fall at the same rate, at least, it has in the past? So I think there's lots of uncertainty about that. But there's probably less uncertainty about the kind of skills that workers are going to need going forward. Rather than focusing on the specific occupations along lists, it's probably better to think about the characteristics of occupations that are going to be growing in the future. And I think a lot of research says it takes some skills, hard skills, knowing how to do certain technical things, but also increasingly soft skills. The basic story is, if somebody can make a computer do what you do, you're probably in trouble. Or if somebody in China can do what you can do, you're probably in trouble. So you need to sort of look for the kinds of occupations that are going to be less subject to either automation or outsourcing in the future. All right, so just a little bit about the demographic kinds of things. This is a graph of labor force participation. So labor force, people are in the labor force if they either have a job or are unemployed and looking for a job. And it's been falling for a long time. It got up 67%. Now it's more like 63 something. And this is a big concern for a lot of reasons. I work at the Federal Reserve, as Karen noted, and one reason that we care is, or the question is the unemployment rate understating how bad things are? And so some people go, wow, labor force participation is falling. That's hidden unemployment, because if you're not in the labor force, you don't get counted as unemployed. However, I think this has been going on long enough. You wouldn't think this is just something recent. And in fact, the red line there is a model that I estimate using data that goes way back, that stops before 2007. So if you looked at all the data available as of 2007, the red line is kind of what you would have expected. And in fact, I wrote a paper in 2001 doing the same kind of exercise, and it basically produced the same kind of result. Even though the numbers have been going up for decades, it was pretty clear that they were going to start to go down. And the reason is because we're getting older. At least I'm getting older. Probably everybody in the room is getting older. And increasingly, that actually is pulling down labor force. But there's also a bunch of trends which, are also on top of that. Even within narrow demographic groups, people are participating less in the labor market. And that's perhaps of concern, but it's not a big surprise. And in fact, the blue line, the actual numbers were actually quite consistent with the red line. And if you also took into account how bad the labor market was doing, how high unemployment was, the dashed red line is showing you like kind of a prediction based on previous trends plus what you know about unemployment. And obviously, unemployment got very high. And when unemployment's high, people withdraw from the labor force to some extent. So I could go on a lot about this kind of thing, but basically the upshot is that going forward, we're going to probably still see labor force participation come down, and that means that the labor force itself is going to be growing more slowly. In fact, the bars on the left, show you basically in the decade of the last millennium. The growth of the labor force was like maybe 1.3% per year. Since then, it's been more like about 0.7% per year, and in the next, say, 6 years, you'd expect to see basically something more like 0.5 or 0.6%. So it's a sort of slower environment. There's fewer workers becoming available. And it's more dramatic, actually, if you focus on the number of young workers available, between 16 and 24, where even in the decade before the millennium, there was almost no growth in the number of young workers in the labor market. And over the last 15 years, it's been dropping the number of young workers, and it's going to get even more steep. And that's because of population trends, but also because people are going to school more, which actually is perhaps a good thing. There is more than a good thing. So the labor force is going to change in a qualitative way. We're going to have more older workers. So the share of workers that are over 55 has gone up a lot and will continue to go up a lot. The share of younger workers in labor force is getting lower and lower. So employers are probably going to have to adapt. And actually, maybe a future family impact seminar, you should talk about like the challenge of sort of keeping older people in the labor force in a productive way. But that's a different topic. All right. And then the other point is that education levels are going up. I think Karen mentioned that many jobs in the future are going to require some sort of post-secondary education. That's already the case that many do, and probably most will. And that's sort of a steady trend. And I think if anything, we would wish it would happen faster, but it's likely to continue to go on. And this explains again why the young people aren't in the labor market as much as they are, because one of the big factors is that they're in school. The fraction of 20 to 24-year-olds who are in school has gone from something like 30% to something like nearly 40%. That's a pretty big change. And even the sort of fraction of 16 to 19-year-olds has gone up. And you might think there weren't very many 16 to 19-year-olds. You would think that most 16-year-olds are already in school, but what's actually changed is there's more summer school. When I went to high school, it was very unusual for kids who were doing well in school to go to summer school. Now it's actually quite common. So school attendance, even among 16-year-olds, is up a lot. Right? Why should school attendance be up? Well, one reason is because it's a great investment, at least on average. These are some figures from one of my colleagues at the Fed, Lisa Barrow, and professor at the University of Chicago. And there's lots of versions of this, but basically what it says is that the rate of return, if you think about it as an investment in education, remains quite high. These are in real terms, and they're sort of saying, it's like a 12% return on investment. If you think about which in nominal terms would be maybe like a 14% return on investment. If you think about what your own investment opportunities are and most sort of things, you're not going to find a lot of things you can invest in and expect to get kind of returns of that ilk without having huge amounts of risk at least. So, traditional four-year college, two-year college degrees remain quite valuable in terms of the rates of return they produce. I didn't have such a convenient slide to sort of talk about the returns to vocational education, but those also remain pretty good. I wrote a paper 10 years ago talking about, this is mainly for workers who lost jobs and needed to find a new one because they were needed to make a career transition. But most of the results say that education like that also pays off, and roughly speaking, it's the same kinds of returns. If you thought about it as an investment, it's something that pays off maybe 8 or 10 or 12% in terms of its rate of return, which is quite good. Of course, it depends a lot on details. There's a bigger payoff for say learning to be a nurse than there is for say learning to be a bartender or a photographer or something like that. But even on average, it seems as if the returns to vocational education remain pretty good, quite good. And in fact, they're better for younger workers, and there's a simple reason for that, and that's because the skills that you get when you're young, you can use for a longer period of time. It doesn't necessarily make sense to retrain somebody for a whole new occupation when they're 60 years old, but if somebody's young, there's a great payoff. So that, again, it reinforces the idea that we ought to be finding ways to get skills to people at early ages. I would say that if you had to sort of worry about investments here, the hardest group of people seems to be disadvantaged young people who say were already high school dropouts, face other kinds of challenges, and that's where the research literature has often not been so happy in terms of the results it's produced. When you do really rigorous experiments, you often find that some programs that you think are going to work have not turned out as well as you would hope. Sometimes that's almost for sure. Like if you give somebody who's a high school dropout, had drug problems and been in jail, if you give them 6 weeks of training, you wouldn't expect to have a really big impact on their lives. But even some things you think might work have not had the best experience. But I think what's been happened is researchers and policymakers continue to experiment and try new things. I know I got interested a little bit in career academies. That seems to have pretty good payoffs and fairly rigorous investments. And I know my fellow panelists are going to sort of talk a lot more about kinds of things that actually can be done for populations like this. A bit about these occupational projections. As I said, they basically expect the industries that grew fast in the past to continue to grow fast. So you're going to probably see education and health continue to grow. The reason construction is growing is because it shrunk so much. Everyone believes it has to kind of come back. But business and professional services is likely to continue to grow. And people that they picked out as Wisconsin industries that maybe will do better than average is manufacturing. Wisconsin's a state in which manufacturing is still a very important part of the economy. And the BLS, Bureau of Labor Statistics, thinks that that's likely to do better here than other places, but they still don't see it rising as a share. They see it shrinking as a share. And some of the occupations that they get pointed to as being, growth occupations tend to be things like, healthcare, personal care. You can guess why that is to some extent. We're getting older. You need more help for older people. But also, those are some of the things that you can't easily get a computer to do. I mean, think about getting a computer to sort of, take care of you in your old age. That's not easy. You also can't build a machine to do it very well, at least not yet, although I know that there are engineers who are actually thinking about that kind of thing. Okay? So, there's an appendix to my slides if you ever want to, need to sleep or something like that, need a little... So you can go through the details of it, but I think it's, it's not real surprising what they say are they going to be the growth areas. It's going to be areas that, have been growing fast in the past. But just to sort of throw some, caution about that, I plotted the share of employment that's been in manufacturing, both for the United States and for Wisconsin. And of course, it's been falling. If you go back to 1950, it's been falling since then pretty steadily. But the last few years has actually flattened out. And part of that could just be that we dropped so much during the bad recession that we had. There had to be some recovery. But I talked to lots of people who seem to think that the U.S. has got a fairly, it's got a future in manufacturing recently. Some of it has to do with the energy boom, for instance, which has made certain kinds of energy cheaper here than other places. So I wouldn't give up on the idea of investing for the workforce of manufacturers just because the BLS says it's going to be a declining share. Another reason actually is also that wages in manufacturing tend to be on the higher end of things. So the thing that you want to do is sort of target, I think, the industries in which wages are high and in which there's a decent chance that employment can grow. And another thing is that manufacturing has an older work, the workforce is getting older, but it's especially true in manufacturing. This shows the share of workers that are over 50 years of age. So, that's fairly similar for a long time between manufacturing and non-manufacturing, but it's now higher considerably for manufacturing firms, which suggests those workers are going to retire and there's going to be a need to refill those positions with new people. So even if the industry isn't growing a tremendous amount, it might need new workers just to sort of stay steady. All right, now a bit more about what are the hot occupations, what are the non-hot occupations, and this is I tried to do a simple version of this. So if you group occupations into 3 categories: low wage, middle wage, and high wage, and basically just on what their typical wages have been, what you see is that growth has been predominantly at the extremes, with relatively little growth on those kind of middle wage occupations. The stories behind this are occupations that used to pay a pretty good wage, didn't require a lot of training necessarily, but those are sort of going away. They would often be actually manufacturing jobs, but they've been shrinking for a long period of time. But now the occupations that have been doing better tend to either be the high wage occupations or some of those low wage occupations. Showed up there, things like home health care aides and whatnot, which there's a large demand for still and continues to grow. And so that's, I think, a characteristic of things you need to be thinking about what kind of workers are going to be needed for the future. All right. And then again, there's a very interesting research literature that's been going on that I can't keep up with myself, but I tried to bring one chart from. I think the idea of it is simple, and it's that if you sort of take occupations and sort of figure out what fraction of what people do in those occupations that's very routine, either routine, cognitive, like moving paper from one thing to another. So a medical transcriber is an occupation that has a high fraction of routine cognitive work. Legal secretary is an occupation with a high fraction of routine cognitive work. Those things have been, as a share of the labor force, have been going down and down and down because you can usually figure out a way to make a computer do those routine cognitive tasks. And also there's a bunch of manual routine jobs, jobs that, an example of this would be like an assembly line job is often it's a manual job, but it's routine. You do the same thing over and over again. When you sort of find the jobs where those kinds of tasks are very common, what you see is those are going down and down over time. So again, here it's the computer or the robot or whatever. If they can do your job, there's a good chance you're not going to have your job in the future. So I think we need to train people for having non-routine tasks, to be able to sort of deal with things. And that includes dealing with people, which actually is not an easy task, and not easy for computers to do either. So my last slide here was a very interesting one. There was a nice article written about it in the New York Times, a paper by a guy named Deming, a young guy, who, this is a little bit complicated, but he basically took all the jobs in the very detailed level, figured out what kind of skills were required for the jobs, and he divided the skills into math skills and people skills or social skills. And so some jobs require a lot of math skills. So like a mathematician, not surprisingly, requires the most math skills, but it doesn't necessarily require an unusual amount of people skills. A job that requires not much math skills, but middle amount of math skills, but a high amount of people skills is a social worker. That's another kind of job that requires that. Social skills, not so much math skills. Child care workers. requires like virtually no math skills, but you know, at least some social skills. So he basically, it's a sort of two-dimensional ranking of jobs, and then asked which are the ones that are growing fast over the last decade or two. And the answer is it tends to be ones where you got both the math skills involved and the social skills involved. And so, you know, that's kind of the lesson, I think, is that you need to be able to sort of operate in a good environment where you have some technical knowledge and at the same time are able to deal with people in various ways, you know, and like that. And again, that sort of fits my theme that if a computer can do it, you probably don't want to train people for it in the future. Okay. So summary, you know, the workforce is likely to grow slower, and that means employers are going to be scrambling to find good workers, and that means they probably ought to be investing, the public ought to be investing to get the skills so that employers are going to have a good group of workers to pull from. And you know, most of those occupational and industrial kinds of things are probably going to continue going forward, but I'd say, you know, be skeptical that there's a lot of certainty about what's happened. You know, it's easy to think of occupations that no one heard of, you know, 10 years ago that actually are quite big. So I actually, at my job, had to hire a UX person. Anybody know what a UX person is? That's a user experience person, someone who knows how to make your website appealing. You know, that's a job that didn't exist, but apparently it's quite hot at the moment. So I think to keep that sort of skepticism in mind. But I think a firmer expectation, something you probably can bank on, is that you're going to need workers that have skills, and that's going to include both the technical skills, knowing how to do some sort of things that are, you know, require training, but also know how to sort of deal with people at the same time. So that's what I have to say. Did I finish on time?
You are good.